June 21, 1941. The Berlin-Moscow Express crosses the border between Germany and the USSR for the last time, with cargoes necessary to sustain the Reich's war economy. Until then, both nations had maintained a commercial and military agreement, which had allowed them to divide up Eastern Europe and, in the case of Germany, to invade France and other countries with ease. Because of this, Stalin had been resting for a few days with his family and friends in the Black Sea resort of Sochi. He was totally confident in his agreement with Hitler and in the peace that Hitler guaranteed him. However, Operation Barbarossa, the code name for Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union, became a reality that night. 3.5 million Wehrmacht soldiers waited on the border for the order to attack in order to advance on an extensive front of almost 3,000 kilometers. The order would arrive at 3:15 a.m. that Sunday. Faced with the German troops, just as they had faced Napoleon almost exactly 129 years earlier, the vast expanses of the Soviet Union open up. The world will hold its breath. Stalin is for the first time in a state of shock, refusing to accept the facts. He is weighed down by his responsibility for having trusted Hitler and for having purged the Red Army by killing many of its best officers. When he learns of the invasion, he suffers a nervous breakdown and isolates himself for several days. His power is hanging by a thread. This is the story of how Germany and Russia went to total war after having been commercial allies for 2 years, and how this alliance allowed both countries to divide up Poland and Eastern Europe. How it also gave Hitler the resources to invade France, Belgium and Holland, regardless of the British blockade. March 24, 1933, in the Parliament of the Weimar Republic, the so-called Enabling Act is voted, under which Adolf Hitler and his cabinet are granted the ability to pass laws without the need for a parliamentary vote. In other words, the dictatorship had just begun. Joseph Goebbels comments, "The will of the Führer has been fully established, votes no longer matter, only the Führer decides." The law is approved with 444 votes in favor and 94 votes against from the Social Democratic Party. Some 81 deputies from the Communist Party cannot participate because they are in prison, accused without proof of setting fire to the Reichstag a month earlier. The Reichstag fire that occurred in February had been used by the Nazi Party to accuse the Communists and imprison them, as well as to call for the aforementioned Enabling Act, where Hitler obtained extraordinary powers. Hitler had based his rise to the top on showing the Third Reich as a barrier against communist expansion and against Judaism, which he associated with a Judeo-Bolshevik plot to dominate the planet. The Soviet Union was thus the main enemy of the German regime, and its fate was sealed. In his book My Struggle, he had written that Germany's destiny lies in expansion towards the east, in the occupation of the fertile Russian lands. The East represents for Hitler the so-called Lebensraum, or living space of Germany. The Slavs who inhabited these lands were called Untermensch, or subhumans, and according to Hitler, they should be deported to Siberia or enslaved, with the right of possession that force gives to superior peoples. But while Hitler rises and consolidates his power in Germany and the Soviet Union, the decade of the 30s is characterized by the iron government of Joseph Stalin. He has no doubt in industrializing the country at full speed and hand in hand with this, in eliminating opponents and anyone who questions his power. Koba, as his friends call him, carries out policies of collectivization of the land, which cause millions of deaths in Ukraine, just as it implements a system of gulags, where it sends 10 million people to work under harsh working conditions in remote climates throughout Russia. The birth of these two regimes was sooner or later destined for conflict. By 1936, both totalitarian models clashed indirectly in the civil war that broke out in Spain. On the one hand, the USSR sent advisors and military material to the Republican side, and on the other, the Germans and Italians supported the side of General Francisco Franco. Spanish troops armed by Stalin directly confronted the Spanish and Italians supported by Germany. Hitler sent the famous Condor Legion of the Luftwaffe, which was decisive for Franco to win the war. In line with this confrontation, around April 1939, Russia proposed to England and France to advance a tripartite defense agreement, but Poland, which already had a pact with these nations, flatly refused. In the event of war with Hitler, the Red Army would have to cross Polish territory, which was a threat. The Poles had fought a war against the USSR in 1920, after which they had achieved independence, and they were not going to take any risks. Winston Churchill himself, who at that time was a relevant politician in England, insisted on signing an agreement with the Soviets. Churchill knew that Hitler would not risk a war on two fronts, although after insisting, the English government refused to listen to him, and the pact did not prosper. In those same days, Hitler surprisingly and unilaterally rescinded the non-aggression pact between Poland and Germany signed in 1934. Dismay reigned. Stalin, for his part, observed and calculated his next move. By May 1939, given the failure of negotiations with England and France, the Soviet Commissioner for Foreign Affairs, Maxim Litvinov, was dismissed and replaced by his counterpart, Vyacheslav Molotov. Molotov is a man loyal to Stalin, more in favor of an agreement with Hitler, whom Winston Churchill defines as the human being who most perfectly represents the modern concept of a robot. Molotov is a cold and calculating chess player, as well as a convinced communist. After Molotov's arrival, Germany and Italy signed the Pact of Steel in Berlin, which represented a challenge to Great Britain and France, and another strong signal to the USSR. After this, the British and French propose an agreement to the Russians, but again they face the same impediment, the intransigent rejection of Poland. In addition to Poland, Romania has the same position as the Poles with respect to the USSR fear and absolute caution. After this new failed attempt, Stalin receives a notification from the German embassy. Hitler wants to start negotiations. Towards August 23, an important person crosses Moscow's Red Square by car. It is none other than Joachim von Ribbentrop, Hitler's pompous Minister of Foreign Affairs. He heads to the Kremlin to meet with Vyacheslav Molotov, his new counterpart from the Soviet Union. He is accompanied by the German ambassador in Moscow, Count Friedrich von der Schulenburg. In his office, Molotov awaits them with a modestly dressed man, in the typical rustic attire of Soviet leaders. In comparison to Ribbentrop's imposing presence, the host is short in stature, with pockmarked skin on his face and stained teeth. This is none other than Joseph Vissarionovich Yugashvili, better known as Stalin, and his presence at the meeting, absolutely unusual, gives an indication of the importance given to the subject to be discussed. The German minister von Ribbentrop announces without preamble that Hitler has authorized him to propose a broad non-aggression pact. 4 days earlier, a trade agreement had already been signed between Germany and the USSR, but now this would be extended and taken to the military field as well. Hitler and Stalin plan to divide Europe into spheres of influence. The pact has two dimensions, one public, which disconcerts European governments, a non-aggression pact, and the other, a secret protocol, for the partition of Poland and the division of Europe, in addition to a great commercial agreement, under which the Soviet Union would sell oil, wheat, and rare metals to Germany. Hitler accepts Stalin's request to include Finland, Estonia, part of Latvia, Bessarabia, and eastern Poland in the USSR's sphere of influence. Stalin is very happy. Neither France nor England would have ever granted him this. That same day, Molotov, now with German complicity, announces to the Estonian foreign minister that he was going to send 35,000 soldiers to protect the country. Stalin, present at the meeting and using all his sadism, intervenes. "Come on, Molotov, don't you think you're being too harsh with our friends? 20,000 will be enough." The division between Germany and the USSR had begun. That night, in the Kremlin Palace, the German delegation is entertained in a sumptuous manner. Stalin himself fills his guests' glasses with vodka and lights their cigars. The best Russian caviar available is abundant, and Crimean champagne is used for toasting. In the midst of the feast, it is Stalin who proposes an unimaginable toast. "As I know how much the German people love their Führer, I would like to toast his health. A lasting friendship should be established with Germany and its great Führer." The strange thing is that Stalin, with his pathological paranoia and great intelligence, is satisfied and calm. So much so that he gives his new ally a special gift. The Soviet NKVD hands over to the Gestapo the German dissident communists who had been arrested by the Soviet government itself. With the signing of the pact, the USSR puts the war aside for a while and can strengthen itself by taking territories as well as selling materials to Germany. Hitler, for his part, secures a vital supply of resources to withstand an English naval blockade. Without Stalin's resources, the British blockade would have strangled the Third Reich in every sense. This is confessed by the Führer himself one afternoon at the Berghof, where he tells his commanders that the pact will serve to evade a certain English blockade imposed by the Royal Navy, which is far superior to the German Navy. He also tells them, "We must be determined from the beginning to fight against the Western powers. The conflict with Poland had to come sooner or later. We must not fear a blockade. The East will supply us with grain, cattle, coal and oil. Germany, whose territory is not sufficiently rich in raw materials, and with a fleet incapable of preventing the British blockade, receives from the USSR almost 2 million tons of grain, 1 million tons of oil, 140,000 tons of manganese, as well as cotton, iron, chrome, copper, nickel, wood, rubber and phosphates. The USSR even secretly served as Germany's intermediary on international markets, acquiring vital war products that were forbidden to Hitler. Stalin also gave Hitler a secret naval base in northern Finland named Basis Nord. The British, who imposed their naval blockade after the German invasion of Poland, isolating the Reich from the rest of the world, was struck by its absolute inefficiency. Russia, whose economy grew with this level of exports, also received a credit of 200 million Reichsmarks for the acquisition of industrial equipment of all kinds. In addition to trade, there were also changes in politics. In the Soviet Union, the change was radical. Before the pact, the slightest suspicion of being fascist or pro-German was grounds for being accused of treason, deported, and most likely executed. But a few months later, as a result of the pact, the situation was reversed. Being pro-German had no consequences and fascism was no longer criticized. In Germany, the media no longer criticize Stalin's communism, nor do they speak of the famous Lebensraum. All differences and hatreds disappear as if by magic. Communists in many countries around the world suspend their anti-fascist activism for the duration of the agreement. They stop criticizing Hitler. Members of the French Communist Party, for example, refuse to do military service when France enters the war with Germany. This pact is one of the most surprising cases in diplomatic history, in which two sworn enemies whose propaganda and ideology were based on defining the destruction of the other as one of the basic objectives, agree on common points at the expense of the rest of the world, knowing that in the medium term they will go to war anyway. 1.5 million soldiers and almost 4,000 armored vehicles cross the Polish border. The Luftwaffe plays its role, and it is the debut of a modern air force with almost 2,000 Stuka, Messerschmitt, and Heinkel aircraft that launch an intense preemptive attack on Polish military targets. These forces are opposed by almost 1 million Polish soldiers, who have 880 armored vehicles, 4,000 cannons and 430 aircraft. Beyond its numerical and material inferiority, Poland's main problem is its extensive line of defense. When planning their offensive, the Poles had decided to defend the entire 1,500-kilometer border, since this would protect the large industrial area in the west and several cities. If they had chosen to defend behind the Vistula River, they could have narrowed the front and resisted more easily, but at the cost of losing their industry and weakening their economy. The strategy chosen, to defend along the entire border, leaves the Polish army exposed to deep attacks. Taking advantage of this, the Germans plan their attack from 3 angles: East Prussia in the north, Poznan in the west, and Silesia and Slovakia in the south. Soon, the penetrations in the extensive front take place, and Poland must begin to retreat in an attempt to re-establish a unified defensive line. The constant bombings of the Luftwaffe, which enjoys great air superiority, make the Polish defense very difficult. Barely a week after the invasion, the Germans reached the Polish capital of Warsaw, which they besieged. The Poles resisted and counterattacked in the Battle of Bzura, where they tried to stop the German advance towards Warsaw with 200,000 men. Although the Polish attack was initially successful and the Germans were driven back 20 kilometers, pressure from the north caused them to be surrounded. The Polish armies of Poznan and Pomorze were surrounded by the German 8th and 4th armies in a large pocket. For several days the Poles tried to break out of the encirclement but were unable to do so, so they surrendered when they ran out of food. Some 170,000 soldiers surrendered to the Wehrmacht, and some 20,000 died in battle. Only a handful of thousands managed to escape the encirclement towards Warsaw. The Germans, who suffered 8,000 dead in this battle, now have a completely clear path to the capital. This is the most important battle of the conflict, and a turning point from which Poland will never recover. After the defeat suffered, the Polish government abandons the capital, along with a large part of the police and other state personnel. The desperate defense is led by General Walerian Tschuma, who has very limited forces. Tschuma orders the mayor of Warsaw, Stefan Starzyński, to mobilize civilians to build barricades and anti-tank traps on every corner. The Germans surround the city, gather 1,000 cannons and bomb it day and night without ceasing. On September 25, around 1,200 German planes dropped their bombs on Warsaw, causing problems with running water and large fires, but despite this, no one surrenders. The Polish Air Force, which had 430 aircraft, had fought the Luftwaffe, shooting down 285 German planes and losing 300 of its own. By this time, some 140,000 people formed the defense of the Polish capital, led by General Tschuma and Mayor Starzyński. Stalin was surprised and worried by the speed, efficiency and power of the German army. He assumed greater resistance from Poland. He began to understand that the German military machine was a greater danger than he thought. The attack on Poland finally motivated the reaction of France and England, who declared war on Germany because of the defensive pact they had with the Poles. 2 weeks later, Russia took its share of the spoils of Poland. An army of 600,000 Soviet soldiers crossed the eastern border. The unsuspecting Poles assumed that they were coming to rescue them. There was almost no resistance. The Poles were unaware of the secret agreement between Germany and the USSR and had concentrated their defenses on the border with the Germans, a mistake that they would soon mourn with tears of blood. After the murders, deportations, pillage, and rape, an accelerated process of Sovietization began. Just 2 months later, all inhabitants of eastern Poland were forcibly converted into Soviet citizens. Stalin, however, emerges diplomatically unscathed from this invasion. England and France only declare war on the Germans. The reason is that within the defense pact they had signed with Poland, there was a clause that obliged them to intervene in assistance if the aggressor was Germany. It did not include the Soviet Union. In addition, Hitler had breached the Munich agreements of the previous year, of not having any more claims in Europe. Despite this, the declaration of war on Germany is merely the fulfillment of a previous commitment given to Poland as a deterrent factor, and no one had planned to go further. France breaks its promise to the Polish government to attack the Siegfried Line, dividing line with Germany, and England breaks its promise to bomb the Germans. The occupation of Poland by both totalitarianisms is brutal. The Soviets deport 1 million Poles to Siberia and Kazakhstan, accused of being dangerous for the new communist regime. Portraits of Stalin are hung in school classrooms and Catholic prayers are banned. The Soviet-occupied zone is the poorest, and is home to 13.7 million Poles who are declared Soviet citizens. On the German side, the 2.5 million Jews are sent to ordinary ghettos, where they live in overcrowded conditions, and where they will gradually be sent to concentration camps. In addition, all Polish cultural heritage is confiscated, and sculptures and monuments commemorating Polish history and culture are destroyed. The German occupation tends towards Germanization, so secondary and higher education institutions are closed, leaving only limited primary education open. In response to this, the Polish resistance organizes secondary and university education clandestinely. In secret places, such as basements, it has 20,000 teachers and reaches 1 million students. Poland's human and material resources are put at the service of the Third Reich, and during the course of the occupation, around 3 million Poles are sent to work in Germany. Hundreds of thousands of Poles are also forced to join the German army, especially with the invasion of the USSR in 1941. The Germans are the masters of the country. As if this were not enough, Stalin and Hitler collaborate with each other to carry out ethnic cleansing. The Germans encourage Jews to migrate to the Soviet zone, and in turn the Soviets expel Catholics from their side. They also exchange information about the Polish resistance that was forming. Once the war with Poland begins, Ribbentrop makes a new visit to Moscow to define precisely the limits of the invasion. Stalin receives Ribbentrop in a pompous manner. The honor band plays the Internationale, while communist and National Socialist flags wave in the sky. Ribbentrop can notice that the arms of the swastika are inverted, but he appreciates the gesture. From this meeting, it is worth highlighting a statement by Stalin that would remain a complete secret until the 1990s. In the notes of the German ambassador, Count von Schulenburg, Stalin says something that would have shocked and filled the free world of that time with terror. The fact is that for the moment, Germany does not require foreign help, but if, against all odds, it were to find itself in a difficult situation, it can be certain that the Soviet people will come to its aid and will not allow anyone to subdue it. A powerful Germany is in the interests of the Soviet Union, therefore, we will not allow it to be overthrown. This definition specifically applied to its future allies, England and France, which had already declared war on the Third Reich. After this, in the luxurious Alexandrevsky Hall of the Kremlin, at the official reception, Stalin introduces von Ribbentrop to the arm that carried out his crimes, Lavrenti Beria. Beria was responsible for the purges and the Gulag system, as head of the secret police, the NKVD. Stalin introduced him by saying, "Here is our Himmler, he is not doing badly either." Warsaw fell to the Nazis a day later. Except for a few minor skirmishes, there had been no incidents between the two occupying armies. Even at the surrender of Brest-Litovsk, the disordered Soviet troops paid formal homage to the disciplined German troops. On September 28, the pact was supplemented by the German-Soviet Treaty of Friendship, Cooperation and Demarcation. In December 1939, the Soviet Union invaded Finland, but the Finns put up a tough resistance, demonstrating the weaknesses of the Red Army. Among the Finnish troops was a man of just 1.52 meters, who managed to annihilate 505 Soviets in just 105 days. Using his rifle without a telescopic sight, Simo Häyhä killed an average of 5 enemies per day and was nicknamed the White Death, becoming a legend for the rest of the war. During this war, Germany remained neutral and did not condemn the USSR's invasion of Finland. This was condemned by the German people, who had a good affinity with the Finns. In addition to this, Hitler also cancelled the sale of arms to the Finns to please Stalin. Fierce Finnish resistance leads to an armistice in March 1940, with huge military losses for the USSR and some territorial annexations on the border. As a result, Russia is expelled from the League of Nations. The outcome of this war confirms Hitler's belief that the USSR was an easy opponent to defeat, and that by kicking in the door the structure would collapse by itself. The Soviets had invaded a much smaller country and had failed to subdue it. They had retreated with 300,000 casualties and over 1,000 tanks destroyed, while the Finns suffered only 70,000 casualties. On the Soviet side, after these disastrous results, winter shelter, equipment and military tactics were improved. In March 1940, a horrendous episode of this first stage of the war takes place, the Katyn massacre. This is the mass murder of Poland's military and intellectual elite by the Russians in the Katyn forests. Around 22,000 people were murdered in cold blood and buried in mass graves. Soviet propaganda years later tried to blame the Nazis, but the victims had been executed by Lavrenti Beria's NKVD. On the other hand, with the British blockade taking place, Hitler launched himself against France, Holland, and Belgium at the same time. The fact that his back was covered, thanks to the signed pact, and knowing that Russia would not attack from the east, allowed Germany to put all its cards on the table in an unprecedented general attack. In addition, the oil and rare metals acquired from the USSR served to boost the German army. The Western Allies had prepared their defense in a somewhat haphazard way. Both the French army and the force sent by England to help would advance into Belgian territory once the German attack had begun, in order to be able to defend further from Paris and at the same time help Belgium. General Gamelin of France had arranged for this movement, with the best troops that would be accompanied by 200,000 well-equipped British troops. But Germany had other plans. Although he would attack Holland and Belgium with force, the main thrust would be through the middle of the Ardennes forest. Hitler, knowing that any other plan would lead to a war of at least 2 years, opted for the plan presented by General Guderian. This absolutely risky and reckless plan consisted of sending more than 1,000 tanks through the few routes that crossed the dense forest. Going through such a narrow place made the plan very vulnerable, since cutting off a route or bombing it was very easy for the French. But once through the forest and across the Meuse River, the panzer divisions would be in an unbeatable position to advance and surround the Allied forces in Belgium. The French High Command had rejected the idea of such a plan from the beginning and sent very few forces to the Ardennes forest. In any case, the Germans who came out of the forest would be stopped in the town of Sedan on the Meuse River. But the German attack hit too fast and too hard, breaking through the wooded roads in just 48 hours. The outdated French war manuals prevented a quick response. The disposition of the tanks also posed a serious problem. Instead of being grouped in divisions of 100 to 200 tanks as the Germans did, the French armored vehicles were mostly distributed within each infantry division. This made the panzer divisions an unbeatable enemy, because the concentrated firepower was so great. To make matters worse, the French defense at Sedan on the banks of the Meuse River was made up of second-rate divisions. These defenses, despite their fortified positions, could do little against the German panzers and the constant bombardment of the Luftwaffe. After 2 days of fighting, the Germans crossed the river without problems and headed at full speed towards the north, surrounding the Allied forces. The noose is closing in on Dunkirk, being a huge pocket of 400,000 Allied soldiers. By this time, Belgium and Holland have already surrendered to Germany, and the French government finds itself in a hole from which it will never emerge. Instead of continuing to fight from its colonies around the world, the French government surrenders after 45 days of fighting, handing over Paris without a worthy battle. The second largest empire on the planet has fallen to Germany in 7 weeks, and now England finds itself alone facing Hitler, whom it will face in an air battle for months. From the other side of Europe, Stalin watches the events with concern. The Soviet leader expected Hitler's war against the West to last at least 2 or 3 years, as indicated by the official reports of the Third Reich, and as had happened in the First World War. Kober had that time in his head to prepare the Red Army for an eventual war, but now reality had revealed itself differently, and if Hitler managed to sign peace with England, he would be free to invade Russia. After defeating France, Hitler began to consider an invasion of the USSR, so he approached Finland. In a good trade exchange, the Third Reich bought wood and nickel from Finland and sold weapons to the Finns. In addition to selling weapons, Hitler also managed to station troops on Finnish territory through a pact. The Finnish government decided to trust Germany and allowed it to place barracks and depots, as well as share defense information. The latter went against the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact and also the peace pact signed between Finland and the USSR after their war. This shows how Hitler was already acting independently and leaving Stalin in the background, while preparing the ground for a possible war with the USSR. By June of that year, Stalin proceeds to invade and take Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, as well as part of Hungary and Romania. The pact signed with Hitler gives him the power to take over these countries without concern, except for the Bukovina region in Romania. In that case, Stalin violates the pact signed with Germany, which angers the Führer. During August 1940, Soviet shipments to Germany are suspended due to several reasons. On the one hand, the German delay in sending material to the USSR, and on the other, the disagreement regarding Romania, a country that Hitler invades. Stalin claims that the Führer should have asked permission, according to Article 3 of the pact. Despite the good relationship, both countries distrust each other. At the end of September, the Axis is formed with the signing of the Tripartite Pact between Germany, Italy, and Japan, which divides the spheres of influence. The Soviet Union is seen as a possible fourth member, although Hitler also keeps his plan to invade under his sleeve. The German ambassador in Moscow, Friedrich von der Schulenburg, is well aware of the Führer's intention to attack Stalin, and writes a document warning of the risks involved. Hitler decides to listen, and a month later begins talks for the Soviet Union to join the Axis. With this intention, the Führer meets with Minister Molotov in Berlin on November 12, 1940. Stalin had sent his minister with the idea of exploring the entry of the USSR into the Axis and at least discovering the details of this alliance. Molotov is received by Ribbentrop at the train station decorated with Soviet and German flags, with an orchestra playing the Communist International in Germany for the first time since 1933. After a brief breakfast at the luxurious Schloss Bellevue Palace, the meeting begins with Ribbentrop clarifying that for them the war against England was won, and it was only a matter of time. And with that in mind, the time had come to draw the spheres of influence definitively, with Italy, Japan, Germany, and the USSR being allies. In the afternoon, Molotov is received by Hitler at the Reich Chancellery. Hitler also speaks of giving that final blow against England, and states that it is time to think about the division of the world after our victory. Molotov is relieved by the Führer's kindness and agrees with Hitler on Soviet participation in the Axis Pact, but only if the Soviets could participate as an active partner. The next morning, Hitler and Molotov resume their conversation with more details on the table. Hitler states that if England were defeated, the British Empire would crumble, and that all the powers should put their differences aside to divide up the spoils efficiently. Molotov, for his part, lets the Führer know that Stalin was interested in Bulgaria, to which Hitler replies that he should discuss it with Mussolini before giving a response. That night, Molotov sends a telegram to Stalin stressing Hitler's great interest in reaching an agreement and strengthening friendly relations with the USSR. What Molotov did not know was that that same night Hitler had issued the secret Instruction Number 18, ordering his forces to continue preparing for war in the East regardless of the ongoing negotiations. After meeting Hitler, Molotov meets Ribbentrop again in a Berlin air raid shelter to finalize details. The German minister hands the Soviet minister a draft proposal that includes the USSR's entry into the Axis, and which consists of two parts, one public and one secret. The public part contains a 10-year agreement by which the parties would respect their spheres of interest, and Germany, Italy, and Japan would affirm their recognition of existing Soviet borders. The secret part included the obligation not to join any additional alliances and to help each other in economic matters. It also defined the territorial objectives of the four signatories. Germany claimed Central Africa, Italy North and Northeast Africa, Japan Southeast Asia, and the USSR south of the center of its territory, including Iran and Iraq. In response to this proposal, Stalin, convinced that he could also obtain Bulgaria, made a counter-proposal, which was sent to the Führer and contained the following elements. German troops would leave Finland in exchange for a Soviet guarantee of continued shipments of nickel and wood, as well as the guarantee that the conflict between Finland and the USSR would not reopen. In the coming months, a mutual assistance pact would be signed with Bulgaria that would allow Soviet bases in that country. The center of Soviet territorial domination would be south of Baku and Batumi, north of Iraq and Iran. The Japanese renunciation of oil and coal rights in northern Sakhalin in exchange for adequate compensation. A joint statement that the Mutual Assistance Treaty between the USSR and Bulgaria is a political necessity. In addition to this, the Soviets promised to deliver 2.5 million tons of grain by May 11, 1941, which would be 1 million tons more than their current obligations. The German negotiator Karl Schur could not hide his joy at the offer, and immediately telegrammed to Berlin that, in view of the present state of negotiations, Molotov's statements today must be seen as a surprising indication of goodwill on the part of the Soviet government. Hitler, however, sees Soviet territorial ambitions in the Balkans as a challenge to German interests. The Führer remarks to his top military commanders that Stalin demands more and more, that he is a cold-blooded blackmailer, and that a German victory over England has become unbearable for Russia, so she must be brought to her knees as soon as possible. Stalin's proposal is never answered. Molotov is stunned by the silence of German officials. Hitler had chosen total war. On December 18, 1940, Hitler signs Directive No. 21 to the German High Command. Under the name Operation Barbarossa, the German Wehrmacht must be prepared to crush Soviet Russia in a rapid campaign. On March 1, 1941, Bulgaria joins the Axis, further unsettling Stalin after Germany continued to ignore the proposal made a few months earlier. Although Stalin was preparing for a possible war, he still believed that he could at least avoid a confrontation in the short term. In an effort to demonstrate peaceful intentions towards Germany, on April 13, 1941, the Soviets signed a neutrality pact with the Empire of Japan, an active member of the Axis. During this signing ceremony, Stalin embraced the German ambassador and exclaimed, "We must remain friends, and you must do everything possible to that end." After 6 months of preparations, Germany invaded the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941, which ended any hope for the proposed alliance. Stalin was so misinformed about what was going to happen that on June 18th, he left for a vacation to Sochi, his favorite place on the Black Sea, where he planned to stay until July 8th. Meanwhile, the gigantic army of the Third Reich was concentrated on the border awaiting the order to attack. Hitler names the invasion after Frederick I, the 12th century Holy Roman Emperor, who was nicknamed Barbarossa for the color of his beard. His reign was considered the First Reich by German nationalists. The size of Hitler's army attacking the USSR is enormous, more than 3.5 million soldiers on a front of almost 3,000 kilometers. The world would hold its breath, in a clash of titans unprecedented in history. Stalin would overcome his initial shock to face the enemy, which he had helped strengthen and which he had implored to join. The German offensive, after months of advancing in Soviet territory, stops 30 kilometers from Moscow. This would be Hitler's maximum advance in central Russia. Poor German logistics, fierce Soviet resistance, the wear and tear of months of fighting and the harsh winter made it impossible to continue advancing. Weakened and exhausted, the Germans took defensive positions 1,800 kilometers from Berlin. Stalin now launches a counterattack in the dead of winter that drives them back 100 to 250 kilometers from the capital. Barbarossa had failed, and the fighting would continue for 3.5 more years. The irony is that without Soviet resources, the Germans could never have launched Operation Barbarossa. It was thanks to these shipments that they were able to accumulate enough grain, rubber, and oil to launch such an invasion. The oil problems during the rest of the war would make it clear that the huge initial push for Barbarossa was thanks to the resources that Stalin had sent to the Third Reich. But the pact not only served to start Barbarossa, but also to withstand the British blockade and invade Poland, Holland, Luxembourg, Denmark, Norway, Belgium, France, Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, and Greece. All these German occupations happened during the validity of the pact between Hitler and Stalin, as well as the creation of the Warsaw Ghetto and the Kristallnacht against the Jewish community. Germany, for its part, remained silent in the face of the Soviet invasion of Finlandia country, with a strong German presence, as well as the Baltic states and Hungary, without mentioning massacres such as Katyn, where 22,000 Poles were killed in an atrocious manner. While the pact lasted, the complicity between the two regimes was absolute. This sinister alliance was what really started the Second World War, and could have ended civilization as we know it. Ironically, after being betrayed by Hitler, Stalin went from requesting a place in the Axis in a few months to desperately requesting help from England and the United States. Despite this, the pact had already unleashed chaos, generating the German-Soviet War that would leave tens of millions dead. The world would begin to recognize the horror of this pact decades later. Towards 1989, the Congress of Deputies of the USSR condemned the signing of the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact and the other agreements signed. 20 years later, in 2009, the European Parliament established August 23, the date on which the pact was signed, as the Day of the Victims of Stalinism and Nazism. If you liked the documentary, don't forget to subscribe and share it with your friends. Best wishes and see you in the next video.